They called him the Wolf of the Bitterroots, a man who hadn't spoken a gentle word in 10 years. When he found her half frozen in the snow, he didn't offer her comfort. He offered her a contract. "Pretend to be my wife," he told her. "Keep my land safe from the bankers, and come spring, you walk away rich. But there is one condition. You never touch me, and you never ask about the past." It was the perfect lie, until the snowed-in nights turned the lie into a dangerous truth. This is the legend of Caleb Holloway and Sarah Miller, a story of survival, betrayal, and a love that burned down the mountain. You think you know how this ends? You have no idea. December 1887, the Montana Territory. The wind didn't just blow in the Bitterroot Mountains, it screamed. It tore through the heavy pine timber like a physical blow, carrying ice shards that could cut skin. For Sarah Miller, the wind was the sound of her own death approaching. She had been walking for 6 hours since the wagon wheel shattered. Her driver, a terrified boy named Toby, had taken one look at the approaching storm and unhitched the only horse, leaving her with her trunk and a promise to send help from the nearest outpost. That was yesterday. Toby wasn't coming back. Sarah stumbled, her boots sinking deep into a fresh drift. Her wool coat, bought second-hand in St. Louis, was woefully thin for a Montana winter. She couldn't feel her toes. The numbness was creeping up her shins, a dull, heavy anchor dragging her down. "I ran from a monster in Chicago, only to die alone in the snow," she thought, the irony bitter on her tongue. She fell. This time her arms didn't have the strength to push her back up. The white world blurred. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. She didn't hear the crunch of heavy footsteps. She didn't hear the low, menacing growl of a timber wolf, nor the sharp click of a Winchester lever-action rifle. She only felt the heat. It was sudden and shocking. A large, rough hand gripping her shoulder, turning her over. Through her frozen lashes, she saw a shadow blocking out the grey sky. A beard thick with ice, eyes dark as coal, and a scar running from his temple to his jawline that distorted his expression into a permanent scowl. "You're 5 miles from nowhere, woman," a voice rumbled. It sounded like rocks grinding together. "You trying to die, or just stupid?" Sarah tried to speak, but her jaw was locked. The man cursed under his breath. He didn't ask permission. He scooped her up as easily as if she were a sack of grain, throwing her over a massive shoulder clad in bear fur. "Don't die on my back," he grunted. "I ain't digging a grave in frozen ground." The world went black. When Sarah woke, the smell hit her first. Pine resin, wood smoke, and the scent of curing leather. She gasped, bolting upright, but a sharp pain in her head made her dizzy. She was in a cabin. It was small but built like a fortress, with logs as thick as whiskey barrels. A fire roared in a stone hearth that took up half the wall. "Drink!" The man was standing by the window, cleaning a skinning knife. He turned. Without the snow covering him, he was terrifying. He stood well over 6 feet, broad in a way that came from swinging axes, not lifting gym weights. He wore buckskins and a flannel shirt strained at the shoulders. He shoved a tin cup into her hand. "Broth. Drink it slow." Sarah's hands trembled so badly she spilled half of it. He watched her, his face impassive, showing neither pity nor cruelty. "Who are you?" she rasped. "Caleb Holloway," he said. The name hit her like a physical blow. Even in St. Louis, people whispered about Caleb Holloway. They said he killed a man in Deadwood with his bare hands. They said he lived on this mountain because society deemed him too savage for civilization. I'm Sarah," she stammered. "I need to get to Helena. My cousin." "Pass is closed," Caleb said, turning back to the window. "Storm set in. Won't break for 3 weeks, maybe 4. You're stuck." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Stuck, alone, with the wolf of the Bitterroots. "I can pay you," she lied. She had $12 to her name. "If you guide me down—" "Money's no good here," Caleb interrupted. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes scanning her face, assessing her. It made her feel like a prize mare at an auction. But you can pay me another way. Sarah froze, clutching the blanket to her chest. I am not that kind of woman, Mr. Holloway. Caleb laughed, a dry, barking sound. Get your mind out of the gutter, city girl. I don't want your body. I want your name. He walked to the table and slammed a piece of paper down. It was a heavy parchment, stamped with an official seal. The Land Commission is coming in the spring, Caleb said, his voice dropping low. A man named Bartholomew Pike wants this mountain. He found a loophole. Says a single man can't hold a claim this size under the new homestead adjustments. He wants to strip my timber rights. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could smell the tobacco and coffee on his breath. I need a wife on paper. You need shelter to keep from freezing to death. That's the trade. Sarah stared at him. You want me to marry you? Pretend, he corrected sharply. We sign the paper when the circuit judge rides through next week, before the pass fully blocks up. You play the dotting wife when Pike's men come sniffing around. You cook, you clean, you mend. Come spring, when the claim is secured, I give you $500 in gold and you get on the first stagecoach out of here. $500. That was enough to start a new life. Enough to disappear where her past couldn't find her. And if I refuse, Caleb gestured to the door, then you can start walking. Sarah looked at the roaring fire, then at the frozen window. She looked at Caleb Holloway, a man who looked capable of snapping her neck, yet had carried her 5 miles to safety. What's the catch? She asked. Caleb's expression hardened. The scar on his face seemed to throb in the firelight. One condition, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You sleep in the loft. I sleep down here. We play the part in town, but in this cabin you are a ghost. You don't touch me. You don't ask about my life before this mountain, and you never, ever try to seduce me. He looked at her with a mix of disgust and warning. I had a wife once, he said, the words heavy with old pain. I don't plan on having another. Do we have a deal? Sarah swallowed hard. Deal. She didn't know it then, but she had just signed a contract that would cost her much more than a winter of her life. The circuit judge, a drunkard named Judge Abernathy, married them 3 days later in the cramped back room of the settlement's general store. He smelled of gin and didn't ask why the groom looked like he was attending a funeral, or why the bride was wearing a dress 3 sizes too big, borrowed from the storekeeper's wife. I pronounce you man and wife, Abernathy slurred. You may kiss the bride. Caleb hesitated. The dozen or so townsfolk gathered, mostly fur trappers and miners, leaned in. Bartholomew Pike's foreman, a weasel of a man named Silas Vane, was watching from the corner, eyes narrowed. Caleb had to sell it. He grabbed Sarah by the waist. His hands were hard, but the heat of them burned through the thin fabric of her dress. He pulled her flush against him. Sarah gasped, her hands instinctively landing on his chest. Under the flannel, his heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. He lowered his head. He didn't kiss her lips. He pressed his mouth to the corner of her mouth, his beard scratching her soft skin, and whispered, "Look happy, damn it." Then he pulled away, turning to the crowd with a triumphant, albeit grim, nod. "Drinks are on me." The charade had begun. The first 2 weeks in the cabin were a war of silence. Caleb was true to his word. He was a machine. He woke before dawn, disappeared into the timber to check traps and cut wood, and returned only when the sun dipped below the peaks. He ate the stew Sarah cooked in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. Sarah tried to earn her keep. She scrubbed the cabin floor until her knuckles bled. She mended his torn shirts. She baked bread using the limited supplies in the larder. But the isolation was maddening, and the cold was a living thing. One evening, a blizzard struck with terrifying ferocity. The wind howled so loud it shook the iron skillet hanging on the wall. The temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly. Sarah was in the loft, wrapped in 3 blankets, shivering violently. Her teeth chattered so loud she was sure Caleb could hear it below. "Girl." His voice floated up from the darkness. Yes? "Get down here." I'm fine. "Get down here before you freeze and I have to explain a corpse to the sheriff." Sarah climbed down the ladder, dragging her blanket. The fire was roaring, but the drafts were brutal. Caleb was sitting in front of the hearth on a bear rug, cleaning his rifle. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the other side of the rug. She sat, pulling her knees to her chest. She watched him. The firelight softened the harsh angles of his face. He was handsome, in a rugged, terrifying way. "Why do they call you the Wolf?" she asked, breaking the condition of silence. Caleb's hand paused on the rifle stock. He looked at her, eyes narrowing. "I told you, no questions. We're snowed in, Caleb. If we don't talk, I'll go mad, and a mad wife won't be much use to you when Pike comes." Caleb grunted. He set the rifle down and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into his tin cup. He hesitated, then poured a splash into a second cup and slid it across the floorboards to her. "They call me the Wolf because I hunt alone," he said finally, "and because I don't leave scraps." "And the scar?" Sarah pressed, emboldened by the whiskey. Caleb touched the line on his face. A reminder. Of what? That trusting a pretty face gets you cut. The venom in his voice was palpable. Sarah recoiled slightly. "I'm not her, Caleb, whoever she was. Aren't you?" Caleb stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow. "You're all the same. Soft, deceitful. You want the security a man provides, but you can't handle the man." He walked over to where she sat. Sarah stopped breathing. He loomed over her, looking down. For a second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he reached down and adjusted the collar of her blanket, pulling it tighter around her neck. His knuckles grazed her jawline. The touch sent a shock of electricity through her that made her toes curl. Caleb froze. He felt it too. The tension in the room shifted instantly from hostility to something heavier, darker. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "Sleep by the fire," he growled, turning his back on her. "But stay on your side of the rug." That night, Sarah lay awake, listening to Caleb's breathing. He was 5 feet away. The heat from the fire was warm, but the heat radiating from the memory of his touch was hotter. The condition was no touching, but he had touched her, and for the first time in her life, Sarah Miller didn't want to run away. She wanted to know who had broken this man, and she wondered, with a dangerous curiosity, if she could be the one to fix him. The blizzard broke 4 days later, leaving the world buried under 5 feet of fresh powder. The silence on the mountain was absolute, broken only by the sound of Caleb shoveling a path to the woodshed. They needed supplies. The larder, meant for 1 sullen man, was stretching thin with 2. "We go to town tomorrow," Caleb announced over a dinner of thin rabbit stew. He didn't look at her. Since the night by the fire, the air between them had been thick enough to choke on. Every movement Sarah made, Caleb seemed hyper-aware of, his eyes tracking her before quickly darting away. "Will the pass be open?" Sarah asked. "No, we take snowshoes to the settlement. Bitterroot Crossing. It'll take half a day." He paused, his spoon hovering over his bowl. "You remember the deal, Sarah. In town, you're my wife. You cling to my arm. You smile. You look at me like I hung the moon." Sarah felt a strange flutter in her stomach. "I remember." Bitterroot Crossing was barely a town. It was a muddy scar etched into the valley floor, consisting of a saloon, a general store that doubled as a post office, a blacksmith, and a smattering of shacks. When Caleb Halloway walked out of the tree line on snowshoes, a petite woman bundled in his spare buffalo coat, trudging behind him, the settlement noticed. They noticed even more when he stopped, waited for her to catch up, and then, with a surprising gentleness that looked entirely unnatural on him, took her mittened hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm. "Stay close," he muttered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Eyes on me. Don't talk to anyone unless I say so." They entered O'Connell's general store. The warmth of the potbelly stove hit them, along with the smell of sawdust, tobacco, and dried apples. Conversation died instantly. A dozen pair of eyes fixed on them. Sarah felt her heart rate triple. She squeezed Caleb's arm tighter. He covered her hand with his own, a heavy, reassuring weight. "Mr. Holloway," Old Man O'Connell said nervously from behind the counter, "didn't expect to see you till Thor, and with company." "My wife, Mrs. Holloway," Caleb announced, his voice booming in the quiet store. He looked down at Sarah, forcing a stiff smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Sarah, darling, this is Mr. O'Connell. We need flour, coffee, bacon if you have it, and bullets. .45, 70 government." While Caleb haggled over prices at the counter, Sarah wandered toward a display of fabrics, trying to play the part of a docile wife interested in domestic things. "Well, well, the wolf found himself a ewe." The voice was oily and close behind her. Sarah spun around. Standing there was a man in a sharply tailored city suit that looked ridiculous in the mud of Montana. He had slicked back hair and eyes like a ferret. It was Silas Vane, Bartholomew Pike's foreman. "Pike heard you got hitched," Vane sneered, stepping too close. He smelled of cheap cologne and stale cigar smoke. "We thought it was a joke. Where'd he buy you, sweetheart? Some crib in St. Louis?" Sarah backed up against a shelf of canned peaches. "Excuse me." Vane placed a hand on the shelf beside her head, boxing her in. "You're too pretty for a beast like Holloway. You know he's going to lose that mountain, right? Pike always gets what he wants. When he does, Caleb will be back to living in a cave. You really want to be stuck out there with a man who probably killed his first wife?" Sarah's breath hitched. "He didn't. Did he tell you about her? About Rebecca?" Vane leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Beautiful woman, just like you. One day she just vanished up there. Caleb said it was bears, but nobody found a body." "Get away from her!" The voice wasn't loud, but it stopped the entire store cold. Caleb was standing 10 feet away. He hadn't drawn his gun, but his entire posture screamed violence. The tendons in his neck were corded tight. Silas Vane straightened up, slicking back his hair with a nervous chuckle. "Just making conversation, Holloway. Welcoming the little lady to the neighborhood." Caleb crossed the distance in 2 long strides. He grabbed Vane by the lapels of his expensive coat and slammed him backward into a stack of empty barrels. The crash was deafening. Vane shrieked. Caleb leaned over him, his scar livid against his pale skin. "You'll speak to my wife again, you'll look at her again, and I'll feed your eyes to the crows. Do you understand?" Yes, Holloway, I get it." Vane scrabbled backward on the floor. Caleb yanked him to his feet and shoved him towards the door. "Tell Pike I'm ready for him, and tell him my wife likes the mountain just fine." Caleb turned back to Sarah. His chest was heaving. He grabbed her hand, not gently this time, and pulled her towards the counter where their supplies were waiting. "We're leaving," he growled. As they hurried out into the cold, Sarah's mind reeled. He had defended her with a ferocity that terrified her. But the name Vane had mentioned echoed in her ears. Rebecca. And the accusation. Had she made a deal with a murderer? Before they left the edge of town, Sarah saw something tacked to the wall of the blacksmith shop. A cluster of wanted posters fluttered in the wind. Most were rough sketches of bearded train robbers, but one caught her eye. It was a photograph, a blurry tin-plate picture of a woman with dark hair pinned up, wearing a high-collared silk dress. The headline above it read, $1,000 reward, wanted for questioning in Chicago, regarding the murder of Jedediah Stone. Sarah stopped dead in her snowshoes. The woman in the photo was heavier, her face unblemished by hardship, but the eyes were undeniably hers. Caleb tugged on her arm. "What is it?" He looked where she was staring. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the poster. He looked back at Sarah, his gaze piercing through her layers of wool. He recognized her. She saw the realization dawn on his face. followed instantly by a shutter slamming down over his emotions. "Move," he said, his voice colder than the wind coming off the peaks. The trek back up the mountain was brutal silence. The act was over. Caleb walked ahead, setting a punishing pace. He didn't offer her his arm. He barely seemed to care if she kept up. When they finally reached the cabin inside the timberline, night had fallen. Caleb threw the supplies on the table. He lit the lantern and turned to face her. "Jedediah Stone," he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "A Chicago banker, rich, powerful, found dead in his study with his own letter opener in his neck." Sarah stood by the door, shivering uncontrollably, and not just from the cold. How do you know that?" "I get newspapers when I go to town, Sarah. I read." He took a step toward her, his bulk filling the small room. "You didn't just run away from a bad situation. You're running from a hangman's noose." "I didn't kill him," Sarah cried, the months of terror finally bursting out. "He was a monster. He bought me from my father to cover a gambling debt. He beat me for sport. That night, he went too far. I was defending myself. I just wanted to get away. I didn't mean to—" She collapsed onto the bearskin rug, sobbing into her frozen mittens. She waited for Caleb to throw her out, to drag her back to town to collect the $1,000. It was double what he'd offered her. Instead, she heard the clink of the whiskey bottle. "Stop crying," he commanded. It wasn't harsh, just weary. He dropped a heavy blanket over her shoulders. Pike and Vane didn't see the poster today. "They were too busy looking at you," Caleb said, staring into the fire. "But they will see it next time. And Pike is the kind of man who would sell his own mother for $1,000. He turned to look down at her. His expression was unreadable, a chaotic mix of anger, suspicion, and something else she couldn't identify. "The deal has changed," Caleb said low. "You aren't just protecting my land anymore. I'm protecting your life. That makes the debt higher." "I'll do anything," Sarah whispered. Caleb's eyes dropped to her lips, then snapped back to the fire. "Get in the loft, before I change my mind." January brought deeper snow and a terrifying closeness. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a cage containing two predators circling each other. Knowing each other's darkest secrets didn't bring them closer. It built a wall of tension loaded with gunpowder. Caleb knew she was a wanted woman. Sarah knew the rumors about his first wife, Rebecca. Yet they couldn't speak of it. The condition held them in a stranglehold. Caleb grew more restless. He spent longer hours in the woods, driving himself to exhaustion just to avoid the air in the cabin, which smelled of Sarah, of lavender soap and baking bread. It was a scent that was slowly driving him mad. One morning, a week after the trip to town, Caleb headed out before dawn to track an elk herd he'd spotted. "Are you coming back for supper?" Sarah asked from the loft, sleep still heavy in her voice. "Don't wait for me," was his only reply before the heavy oak door slammed shut. The day passed slowly. Sarah mended his spare buckskins, her fingers tracing the old scars in the leather. By late afternoon, the sky turned bruised purple, threatening another snow. Caleb didn't return at sundown. By 8 o'clock, fear began to gnaw at Sarah's gut. He was the wolf. He knew this mountain better than anyone. But even wolves could be caught. At 9 o'clock, she heard it. Not footsteps, but a dragging sound outside the door, followed by a heavy thud against the wood. She grabbed the Winchester off the wall, levered around into the chamber, and threw open the door. Caleb was on his hands and knees in the snow. The white ground beneath him was stained a shocking, vibrant crimson. His buffalo coat was shredded on the left side, soaked in blood. "Caleb!" She dropped the rifle and rushed to him. He collapsed onto his side, his face grey, his eyes unfocused. "Cat!" he ground out through clenched teeth. "Mountain lion, big female, got the jump on me. We have to get you inside." Sarah didn't know where the strength came from. Adrenaline surged through her small frame. She grabbed him under his arms, slipping in the bloody snow, and dragged his 200-plus pounds over the threshold. He groaned, a sound of pure agony, as she got him onto the bearskin rug before the fire. "Whiskey," he gasped. She poured a cup and held it to his lips. He drank it down like water. "I need to stop the bleeding," Sarah said, her hands shaking as she reached for the buttons of his ruined coat. Caleb's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. His grip was weak, but the intent was clear. The condition: no touching. "Let me die, woman," he snarled faintly. "Don't touch me." Sarah looked at his blood pooling on the rug, then into his delirious eyes. "No deal, Holloway," she fiercely whispered. She ripped her wrist free and tore open his shirt. The sight made her gag. The cat's claws had raked deep across his left side, from his ribs down to his hip. The flesh was laid open, muscle exposed. She needed to cauterize it. She threw his hunting knife into the glowing embers of the fire until the blade turned cherry red. "This is going to hurt," she said, kneeling over him. Caleb looked up at her. The pain had stripped away his defenses. He wasn't the wolf right now. He was just a man terrified of dying alone. "Do it," he whispered. She pressed the hot steel to the wound. The sound he made was inhuman, a guttural roar that shook the cabin walls. His body bucked violently, his back arching off the floor. Sarah threw her entire weight onto his chest to hold him down, her legs straddling his hips, her hands pressing the burning metal into his flesh. The smell of searing meat filled the small room. He screamed until his voice broke, then fell back, unconscious. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat beside him, bathing his forehead with cool water as a raging fever took hold. He thrashed in his delirium. He spoke names she didn't know. He called out for his mother, and then, in the dead of night, he grabbed Sarah's hand, pressing it to his fever-hot cheek. "Rebecca," he mumbled, tears leaking from his closed eyes, tracking through the grime and blood on his face. "Rebecca, don't go. I'm sorry. I promise I won't get angry again. Please, baby, don't leave me up here alone." Sarah's heart broke for him. The monster of the mountain was just a man broken by guilt. She didn't pull her hand away. She stroked his rough beard, murmuring softly, "I'm here. I'm not leaving." She realized then that Silas Vane was wrong. Caleb hadn't killed his wife. He loved her with a terrifying intensity, and her loss had destroyed him. For 3 days, the fever raged. Sarah only left his side to add logs to the fire or melt snow for water. She bathed him. She changed the dressings on his side, forcing herself to look at the angry, puckered wounds. She spooned broth into his mouth. She touched him everywhere. The condition was shattered. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah fell asleep, sitting upright against the hearthstones, exhausted. She woke to the feeling of eyes on her. Caleb was awake. He was propped up slightly against a stack of furs. His face was gaunt, pale beneath his beard, but his eyes were clear. They were fixed on her face. "You're alive," she breathed. He looked down at his bandaged side, then back at her. He seemed to be trying to piece together the last few days. "You stayed," he croaked, his voice wrecked from the screaming. "You were dying. You could have let me die. You could have taken the money box under the floorboards and run before Pike got here." "Is that what you think of me?" Sarah asked, hurt stinging her eyes. Caleb held her gaze for a long, agonizing silence. The air in the cabin changed again. It wasn't hostile anymore. It was heavy with something new, something born of blood and shared trauma. He reached out slowly, wincing from the movement, and took her hand. His skin was cool now, the fever gone. His thumb traced the veins on the back of her hand. "No," he said quietly. "That's not what I think of you at all, Sarah Miller." It was the first time he had used her real name without accusation. The sound of it on his tongue sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The wolf had survived, but the man who woke up was different. And he was looking at her not as a contract, but as the woman who had pulled him back from hell. Caleb's recovery was slow. For 2 weeks, he was largely confined to the cabin, his immense strength sapped by blood loss. The dynamic shift was jarring. The no-touching rule was impossible to enforce when she had to help him stand, change his bandages, or help him dress. Every touch was charged. When she wrapped fresh linen around his ribs, her breasts would brush against his arm. He would stiffen, his breath hitching, but he didn't pull away. When she helped him shave, her fingers tilting his chin, his dark eyes would lock onto her mouth with a hunger that made her weak in the knees. The cabin felt smaller than ever. The air was thick with unspoken desires and the ghosts of the past that they still hadn't fully exorcised. Caleb was growing stronger, and with strength came his characteristic, brooding intensity. He hated being dependent. He hated the softness he felt creeping back into his soul. One evening, a month before spring was due, the tension finally snapped. Sarah was stirring a pot of beans over the fire. Caleb was sitting at the table, cleaning his Winchester. He had been silent all day, a dark cloud hanging over him. "You called for her when you were delirious," Sarah said softly. She didn't turn around. The words just slipped out. The rhythmic shick-shick of the cleaning rod stopped. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous. Sarah turned slowly. "Rebecca, you begged her not to leave you. You apologized for your anger." Caleb stood up so fast his chair clattered backward onto the floor. His face was a mask of fury. The scar throbbed. "I told you never to speak that name. We can't keep living like this, Caleb. It's haunting you." Vane said. "Vane is a liar!" Caleb roared. He stalked toward her, cornering her against the stone hearth. "You think you know me because you sponged my forehead. You know nothing." "I know you didn't kill her," Sarah yelled back, refusing to back down this time. "I know you loved her, and her leaving broke you. Why can't you just admit that you're human?" "Because being human gets you killed out here. Being soft gets you crushed." He was breathing hard, looming over her. He was terrifying, but Sarah saw the raw panic beneath the rage. He was terrified of feeling anything again. "You aren't alone anymore, Caleb," she whispered, reaching up to touch his scarred cheek. He flinched violently, as if she'd struck him. "Don't." "Why? Because it breaks your condition? We broke that weeks ago. Because if I start," he rasped, his voice trembling, "I won't be able to stop. And you will leave, just like she did. Everyone leaves." "I won't leave. You're a city girl running from a murder charge. Of course you'll leave." "Try me." It was a challenge, a dare. Caleb stared at her. He looked at her mouth, pink and trembling. He looked into her defiant blue eyes. The dam broke. With a groan that sounded like a defeated animal, he slammed his hands against the stones on either side of her head, trapping her. He leaned down and crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was 10 years of loneliness, rage, and repression exploding in a single moment. It was rough, clumsy, and desperate. His beard scratched her face. His teeth clashed against hers. Sarah gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, tasting her. He tasted like whiskey and wood smoke and raw need. She should have pushed him away. It was madness. Instead, her hands flew up, gripping the front of his flannel shirt, pulling him closer. She met his passion with her own, a fire igniting in her belly that she hadn't known existed. He broke the kiss to bury his face in her neck, inhaling her scent, his breath hot against her skin. One large hand moved down her back to her waist, pulling her hips against his. The evidence of his desire was hard and undeniable against her stomach. "Sarah," he groaned against her throat. "God help me." He bit down gently on the cord of her neck, sending a shockwave of pleasure through her. Her knees buckled. The sound of her sharp intake of breath seemed to snap him back to reality. He froze. He pulled back suddenly, stumbling away from her as if she were radioactive. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide with horror at what he had just done, what he wanted to keep doing. "No," he whispered, backing towards the door. "No, this isn't the deal. Caleb, wait." "Get upstairs," he snarled, the wolf returning with a vengeance, shielding himself with cruelty. "Get in the loft. If you come down tonight, I swear, Sarah, I won't be responsible for what happens." He turned and fled out the door into the freezing darkness, leaving Sarah leaning against the warm stones of the hearth, her lips swollen, her body humming, and her heart sinking like a stone. She had tasted the fire, and now she was left alone in the cold. March 1888. The thaw arrived not with warmth, but with mud. The pristine white isolation of the mountain dissolved into a grey, weeping sludge. The silence was replaced by the roar of the river, swelling with meltwater. Inside the cabin, the silence remained. Since the night of the kiss, Caleb and Sarah had lived like ghosts. Caleb slept in the barn with the horse he'd recovered. Sarah slept in the cabin. They spoke only when necessary. The air was heavy with things unsaid, a compressed spring waiting to snap. Sarah watched him from the window as he chopped wood. He moved with a savage intensity, as if he were trying to hack away the memory of her taste from his mind. She knew the snow was melting. The pass would be opened soon. The contract was ending. She had fallen in love with a man who couldn't wait to be rid of her. Or so she thought. On the 3rd Tuesday of March, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. It wasn't just one horse, it was a cavalcade. Sarah froze, the dough she was kneading clinging to her fingers. She looked out. 6 riders were splashing through the mud of the clearing. In the lead was Bartholomew Pike, looking regal on a white stallion. Beside him was Silas Vane, and behind them, wearing a badge that glinted in the weak sunlight, was a U.S. Marshal. Caleb was already standing in the yard, his axe resting on his shoulder. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "Halloway!" Pike shouted, his voice jovial. "The snows have cleared. We've come to finalize our business." Caleb didn't move. "I told you, Pike, the land isn't for sale, and I have a wife now. The claim holds." "Ah, yes, the wife," Vane sneered, sliding off his horse. He pulled a rolled-up piece of paper from his saddlebag. "About that." The marshal stepped forward. He was a hard-faced man with a moustache that hid his mouth. "Caleb Halloway?" "That's me. I have a warrant here for the arrest of a Sarah Miller, alias Sarah Halloway," the marshal announced. "Wanted for the murder of Jedediah Stone in Chicago. We have information she is harboring here." Sarah, listening from the cracked door, felt her blood turn to ice. Vane had done it. He had sent word the moment the telegraph lines were repaired. Caleb didn't look at the cabin. He stared at Vane. "She's my wife. Under territorial law, you can't compel her to testify, and you can't take her without a hearing." "Oh, we aren't here for a hearing," Pike interrupted smoothly. He lit a cigar, the smoke drifting over the muddy yard. "We're here for a trade." Pike dismounted and walked up to Caleb. He lowered his voice, but in the thin mountain air, Sarah heard every word. "Here is the situation, Mr. Halloway. You sign the deed. You transfer the timber rights and the water access to the Pike Mining Consortium. In exchange, the marshal here realizes he made a mistake. It turns out the Sarah Miller he's looking for was seen in Denver. He rides away. You take your little killer and you disappear. Or," Pike smiled, a shark showing its teeth. "Or you refuse. The marshal takes her. She hangs in Helena within the month, and eventually I get the land anyway, because a grieving widower rarely fights hard in court. It was the ultimate trap, the land Caleb had sacrificed his humanity to protect, or the woman who had brought him back to life." Sarah pushed open the door. She couldn't let him do it. She couldn't let him lose everything for her. "Caleb, don't!" she screamed, stepping onto the porch. Vane pointed a finger at her. "There she is! Grab her!" 2 deputies moved forward, hands on their holsters. Caleb raised his axe. The deputies froze. "Hold on!" Caleb roared. His voice echoed off the granite peaks. He looked at Sarah. His eyes were unreadable, dark voids that gave nothing away. Then he looked at the mountain, the trees he had planted, the cabin he had built with his own hands. He looked back at Pike. "Where is the paper?" Caleb asked quietly. "No!" Sarah cried, running into the mud. "Caleb, this is your life! He's bluffing!" "I don't bluff," Pike said, producing a document and a fountain pen. He laid it on a flat stump. "Sign here, Holloway, and she goes free." Caleb walked to the stump. He didn't look at Sarah. He picked up the pen. "Caleb, please," she sobbed, grabbing his arm. "I'm not worth it. I'm just a—" He shook her off, roughly. "Quiet, woman," he snapped. It was the same tone he had used the day he found her in the snow. Cold, dismissive. He bent down and scrawled his signature. Pike snatched the paper up, grinning like a demon. A wise choice. The wolf has been tamed. The marshal tipped his hat. "My mistake, folks. Looks like our fugitive is in Denver after all. Let's ride, boys." Pike and Vane mounted up, laughing. They had won. They had stripped the wolf of his den. As they rode away, disappearing into the tree line, Sarah stood in the mud, trembling. She looked at Caleb. He was staring at the retreating figures. "You gave it up," she whispered. "Everything you worked for." Caleb turned to her. The coldness was gone, replaced by a blazing intensity that terrified her. "Get inside," he ordered. "Pack everything you can carry. We have 10 minutes. "What? Why? They said we were free." Caleb walked past her into the cabin, tearing the loose floorboard up to reveal the iron box of gold he had been saving for 10 years. "Pike is a businessman," Caleb said, shoving gold coins into a leather sack. "But Vane is a loose end. Vane knows you're wanted. As long as Vane is alive, he has a hold over us. He'll come back for blackmail. Or he'll sell you out to Chicago for the reward money anyway, once the deed is recorded." He stood up, strapping his gun belt on. He checked the load in his Colt Peacemaker. "I didn't buy your freedom, Sarah. I bought us a head start." They rode hard. Caleb put her on the horse while he ran alongside, holding the bridle, moving with that impossible stamina of a mountain man. They didn't head down the mountain towards the town. They headed up. "Where are we going?" Sarah shouted over the wind. "High Pass," Caleb panted. "There's a bridge over the gorge. It's the only way back to the main road that bypasses the town. Pike and Vane will cross it to get the deed to the registrar in Helena. You're going to ambush them?" "I'm going to kill them," Caleb said simply. They reached the overlook an hour later. The gorge was a jagged tear in the earth, a 200-foot drop to the white water below. A narrow wooden bridge spanned the gap. Caleb tied the horse deep in the brush. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard. "Stay here," he told her. "No." Sarah grabbed his arm. "I am not staying behind. This is my fight, too." Caleb looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had allowed her to cauterize his wound. He nodded once. "Stay low. If I go down, you ride. You don't look back." They positioned themselves behind a cluster of boulders overlooking the bridge. 20 minutes later, the riders appeared. Pike and Vane were in the lead, laughing, drunk on victory. The marshal and his deputies were lagging behind, clearly uncomfortable with the corruption they had just participated in. When Pike's horse stepped onto the bridge, Caleb levered his rifle. Crack! The shot didn't hit a man. It hit the rope supporting the far side of the bridge railing. The wood splintered. Pike's horse reared in panic. "Holloway!" Vane screamed, spinning his horse around. Caleb stepped out from the rocks, the rifle shouldered. "Drop the deed, Pike, and drop your guns." "You signed it!" Pike yelled, struggling to control his mount on the swaying bridge. "It's legal!" "I signed it under duress," Caleb shouted back. "And you threatened my wife." Vane didn't wait. He drew his pistol and fired wild shots up the slope. Bullets chipped the granite near Sarah's head. Caleb didn't flinch. He fired again. Bang! Vane's pistol flew out of his hand, a spray of red misting the air. Vane howled, clutching his shattered hand. "The next one goes in your chest, Silas," Caleb warned. The marshal, seeing the position they were in, trapped on a narrow bridge with a sharpshooter above them, raised his hands. "We're done here, Pike. I didn't sign up for a war." "You coward!" Pike shrieked. He spurred his horse, trying to charge across the bridge to the other side. "Caleb, he's getting away with the paper!" Sarah cried. Caleb tracked the moving target, but the bridge was swaying violently. He couldn't get a clean shot at Pike without risking hitting the horse. Suddenly, a shot rang out from beside Caleb. Pike stiffened. A bloom of red appeared on his shoulder. He slumped forward, the deed falling from his hand, fluttering down into the gorge, lost forever in the roaring water below. Caleb turned. Sarah was holding the smoking Winchester, the recoil having knocked her back against the rocks. Her face was pale, but her aim had been true. "I told you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I was defending myself." Down on the bridge, the scene was chaos. Pike was wounded. The deed was gone. The marshal had seen enough. "Go!" the marshal yelled at his deputies. "Turn around! We're leaving!" Vane, clutching his bleeding hand, looked up at the ridge with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Holloway. The law is gone, Vane," Caleb roared. "And if you ever set foot on this mountain again, I won't shoot your hand. I'll bury you in it. Now." Vane looked at the marshal retreating, then at the blood on his saddle. He spun his horse and galloped after them. Silence returned to the gorge. Caleb lowered the rifle. He looked at Sarah. She was trembling, the adrenaline crashing. He walked over to her. He didn't say a word. He took the rifle from her hands and set it against a rock. Then he framed her face in his rough, calloused hands. "You shot a man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was going to take our home," Sarah said. "Our home." The words hung in the air. Caleb smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It transformed his face, erasing the years of hardship, softening the scar. "The condition," he murmured, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I think we broke it." "I think we shattered it," Sarah replied. "Then I have a new one," Caleb said. "Oh?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And what is that, Mr. Holloway?" "You never leave," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You stay. You be my wife. For real. Not for the land. Not for safety. For me." Sarah reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Deal." He kissed her then, right there on the ridge, with the smell of gunpowder and pine in the air. It wasn't the desperate, angry kiss of the winter. It was a promise. They say Caleb Holloway and Sarah Miller never left the mountain. With the deed destroyed and Pike wounded, the mining company moved on to easier prey. The marshal, embarrassed by his involvement in the extortion, buried the warrant for Sarah Miller, reporting that the fugitive had fled to Canada. Sarah and Caleb used the gold not to run, but to build. They expanded the cabin, they raised horses, and 3 years later, the town doctor was summoned up the mountain to deliver a baby boy. They lived a life that was hard, brutal, and beautiful. They were the king and queen of the Bitterroots. Years later, when Caleb was an old man, someone asked him about the wolf of the Bitterroots. They asked him if he missed the silence of his solitude. Caleb looked at Sarah, grey-haired now, but still fierce, sitting on the porch, rocking a grandchild. "Solitude is safe," Caleb said, "but love is the only adventure worth dying for." And that is the legend of the wolf and the winter bride, from a contract of convenience to a bond forged in blood and snow. It brings up a powerful question. Do you think Caleb was right to sign away his life's work to save her? Or was he foolish to trust that they could survive without the land? If you enjoyed this story of survival and romance in the Wild West, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Next week, we're diving into a tale about a female outlaw who stole a train, not for gold, but to save her sister. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and see you on the trail.